It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears have linebackers trending in opposite directions, but a new defensive coordinator and a return to the Vic Fangio style of defense could do wonders for both of them. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for more Bears talk, and subscribe to the Locked On Bears YouTube channel for all of our video content, in addition to your regularly scheduled podcasts. On the show today, training camp previews continue with the inside linebackers. We'll start with Roquan Smith's ascension and where he can still go from here. We'll talk about the decline of Danny Trevathan and just how much he might have left in the tank. And then we'll look at the other linebackers and sort of the future of the position that seems a little bit murky, with the Bears seeming to do everything they can to avoid the young guys they've been developing for the last few years. I think Roquan Smith rightfully got a lot of credit last season, but I struggle a little bit with how much is too much. I think a lot of Bears fans were ready to crown him as the next great Chicago Bears inside linebacker, and he certainly had a strong season, an encouraging season, and more steps in the right direction that we want to see from the young Bears linebacker. But I don't know that it was as huge of a step as maybe a lot of Bears fans wanted to make out. Don't get me wrong. Very encouraging. It marked progress from the year before, and it's everything we want to see from a young top 10 pick at linebacker. But there is still room for improvement here, right? Let's not pretend that he has perfected the linebacker position. Roquan Smith is not Brian Urlacher yet, right? He hasn't gotten to that level of linebacker play. And so there is room here for another step forward. What we really saw was some real progress in coverage, making some really nice plays, showing off that athletic ability that got him drafted so high by the Chicago Bears. And for me, a lot of it was instincts starting to really catch up to that NFL speed and NFL game. That, in his first couple of seasons, he was always this fast, right? But it's about thinking versus reacting on the field and being able to just sort of know instinctively where you need to go and how offenses are trying to attack you. He's not having to stand there and read as much and figure out, okay, wait, where do I go now? And where do I go now? And then use his speed to catch up. Now he can be a little bit more proactive with that speed and know a little bit better where he needs to go and when he needs to go there. For me, it's kind of about the spacing between, the other linebackers in zone and knowing your responsibilities and knowing, okay, if this route is coming here, that should signal in my mind that another route might be coming there based on the concept that I'm familiar with from having scouted my opponent ahead of time. It's sort of that veteran savvy level of coverage understanding that you look for a linebacker to eventually build up to over the years. You don't expect it for him to just come in like that as a rookie. And so absolutely, you want to see Roquan Smith keep all of that up and continue to make progress in that area. But where we still see some issues is in run defense. And that's where he needs to be, frankly, I think a lot better, because we just haven't seen that same incremental progress that we've seen in coverage and in other aspects of his game. Don't get me wrong. Coverage is more important, right? I would much rather have him be good at coverage and need work in run defense than be good in run defense and need work in coverage. It is the more valuable skill for a young linebacker to have. But if we're going to crown him as this Pro Bowl all-star, top-notch NFL linebacker, you have to be good at both. Too often for me, he's just not quite filling gaps correctly. When you watch him on tape, it's almost like he's too focused on the ball carrier and trying to make the big tackle and the big play, as opposed to really fully being immersed in the blocking scheme in front of you and where you are supposed to be to combat that blocking scheme. And I understand, like, as a linebacker, you do have to keep your eyes on the ball carrier, right? I mean, that's going to tell you where the block's going to go and where you need to go to try and make that tackle. Absolutely. But you kind of have to have your eyes on both. And it's one of those things that like sounds physically impossible, but you're kind of looking at one while paying attention in your peripherals to the other one to know, okay, I'm watching the running back, but I can see while I'm staring the running back, see the guard coming up towards me and know I have to get over him. And sometimes Roquan can be just a little bit too focused on the ball carrier. And for me, sometimes it's more important to do your job in terms of getting to the spot where you're supposed to be so that someone else can step up and make the tackle on the running back. That you don't always need to be the guy who makes the play. Sometimes the ball comes to you or comes to your gap and you need to make the play. But too often I think Roquan is trying to skirt around a block or get a little bit out of his position to go try and make a play, but then leave something vulnerable where he was supposed to be and ultimately ends up hurting the defense in those individual moments more than he's helping. And so some of that comes down to getting over blocks a little bit easier. And, if a guard is coming free to the second level, sometimes he gets swallowed up by that a little bit too easily. I think having somebody like Eddie Goldman back in the defensive line should make a world of a difference in terms of not having blockers getting quite as free to that second level as easily as you used to. Just having fewer of those clean blocking opportunities for Roquan to have to work around should help him play a little bit better and maybe allow him to be a little bit more aggressive in run defense. But I think there's some scheme understanding and even some run instincts that just need to keep being ironed out the way we saw his coverage instincts sort of catch up to what the NFL offenses were trying to do him. And hopefully then if Goldman is back and Akeem Hicks maybe starts to return to form, if that whole defensive line can start to elevate a little bit more, if they can start to get the edge rushers back on track, all the things we've talked about in the last 2 training camp preview podcast episodes, that should make Roquan Smith's job easier. And it should make Danny Trevathan's job easier too. And he's a guy that might need that even a little bit more, as we've seen now back-to-back years of starting to show some decline. We'll try and figure out just how much Danny Trevathan has left in the tank next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears brought to you by BetOnline.ag, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your sports action. Plenty of Chicago Bears bets you can make even in July, as we haven't even gotten to training camp yet. You can already bet on so many different things for the upcoming season. Not only how the team is going to finish, whether they'll make the playoffs, the win totals, Super Bowl matchups, and so much more, but individual players, Justin Fields to be Offensive Rookie of the Year, Allen Robinson to be the receiving yards leader, Matt Nagy to be potential Coach of the Year. You can also bet the reverse and bet on which coach you think will be fired first, plus bets for basketball, soccer, hockey, tennis, baseball, you name it. They've got it at betonline.ag. Sign up today for a free account and enter our promo code Locked On to receive your free 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Don't get me wrong. I really like Danny Trevathan. He is easy to root for. He's an important leader on this Bears defense. He's a little bit more vocal, at least at this stage of his career, than Roquan Smith has been up to this point. We've sort of seen that changing of the guard, that mantle sort of being held over as Roquan Smith steps into more and more comfort in that role. But we have seen that this defense is missing some kind of juice and some kind of energy when Danny Trevathan is not on the field. But that being said, we could still like Danny Trevathan a lot and also acknowledge back-to-back years of declining play in Chicago. I mean, he's fallen far from the guy we saw in 2018. And 2 years ago, 2019, that ended with the elbow injury, and maybe there was some stuff there that was slowing him down along the way. And he only got half the season, so he didn't know. There wasn't a lot of time for him to sort of turn things around as the season went on, because the season just didn't go on. But 2020 was a full 17-week, 16-game season for Danny Trevathan. And as I was looking back, I don't think he ever appeared on the injury report with anything serious enough to get that designation or maybe miss, a lot of practice from that. So you don't necessarily have that's the same injury question. I'm willing to sort of admit that a lot of times these veteran players are just playing through minor things that aren't bad enough to show up on the injury report every week. And so, but so it's there and it's maybe a factor, but it's a factor that almost all the players are dealing with. And so it's not necessarily going to be exclusive to any particular linebacker. But for Trevathan, the injury concern is much larger in the sense that in his NFL career, 9 seasons now, he has played 3 of them where he did the whole full 16-game slate. He's never done it in back-to-back years. He's done it twice in his, 4-ish years in Chicago, but only once before that in Denver. Pretty consistently, he has had season-ending injuries that have limited him to his few, it's usually not even more than 12 games is what you'll end up getting from Trevathan more often than not. So history would suggest we might not get a full 16-game season, or now 17-game season from Danny Trevathan this year. And he's not getting younger, right? I mean, he's only 31. Only 31 is kind of a relative term in terms of years of experience, but he is on the wrong side of his prime. Pretty rare that a guy is going to turn around and sort of be revitalized as he gets later and later in his career. Sort of, I guess, Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers and other quarterbacks a little bit excluded, but a lot of wear and tear on Danny Trevathan's body, a lot of surgeries on that body, and you just don't know exactly how much better he can turn around at this point. Maybe last season had some extenuating factors with COVID and the rest of the defense struggling, and we'll get into that in a moment. But really, I thought he was too regularly exposed in coverage. It seemed like that was a focal point for opposing offenses to really attack that middle of the field and specifically try and get different matchups on Trevathan, because Roquan was not as much somebody they really wanted to challenge, although they did end up throwing the ball a lot at both of them throughout the season. It was really, I think, often trying to be about getting a wide receiver matched up on a linebacker. Of course, you want to get those types of mismatches if you're an opposing offense. But I think there's some blame here for scheme. Chuck Pagano wasn't always putting Danny Trevathan in the absolute best spot to shine, but there's only so much you can do to hide a player who's struggling or slow in coverage, right? I mean, he has to cover somebody. And as the defense, you don't always get to pick, right? I mean, you can call man coverage and put him on a running back or a tight end, but you can't call man coverage every time. And this Bears defense is not one that runs a ton of man coverage. They are a very heavily zone coverage team. And you might think then that would be more advantageous for Trevathan, that he can just sit in a spot and not necessarily have to man-to-man cover a wide receiver down the field, right? I mean, of course, that's everything you're trying to avoid in this defense. But I think it can get lost sometimes for a lot of people that zone coverages often become man-to-man coverage for individual players, depending on where you are in the field and what the different adjustments are that you're calling. But especially in, a cover 3 type of single deep with the cornerbacks going deep zone coverage, a lot of times you have a receiver coming into your zone and you sort of start playing man-to-man coverage on that player that comes into your zone, because the seams can be vulnerable vertically, and that you're sort of responsible for a certain area that can be vulnerable in this defense and in that coverage specifically. And so while the play call is zone, sometimes Danny Trevathan can become a sort of man-to-man defender with zone on other areas of the field, and that ended up being a great disadvantage too often for these Bears linebackers. So maybe as new defensive coordinator Sean Desai starts to get back to more of the 2 deep coverages as opposed to the single deep coverages that we saw a little bit more of from Chuck Pagano. It's not as cut and dry as Pagano was all single deep and Desai will be all 2 deep. Pagano did plenty of 2 deep coverages too, but it's more about sort of balancing what types of coverages you're going to throw at opposing defenses. It's a lot of what we talk about with Eddie Jackson and trying to get him back on track. But maybe more of those 2 deep shells would give Danny Trevathan more opportunity to pass off some of those coverage responsibilities where he doesn't have to man up. If the receiver's coming across the middle of the field into his zone, he can stay with him in that zone and then pass that off to the next guy and sort of return to his spot and not have to be trailing a guy across the field in some of those same vulnerable ways that we saw last season, right? There's room to help Danny Trevathan more in coverage. But I was also a bit concerned with what seemingly how uncharacteristic it was for him to be out of place in run defense as well. kind of like what we talked about with Roquan Smith. But I think with Danny, some of it was him being slow and not being as quick to the spot as you might like. That if he and an offensive lineman are trying to get to the same area, the offensive lineman was getting there first a little bit more often. And some of that is about the read the linebacker's making. The guard knows what the run is and where he's supposed to go. Trevathan has to figure out what the run is and where the run is supposed to go and then get there. So the offense inherently has an advantage there, but obviously offensive linemen a lot slower than linebackers. So it's sort of how that timing plays out for him to get there. And it just felt like he was a little bit slow there. Then when he would get, swallowed up by blocks, he too struggling to really fight through and get over those. Again, return of Eddie Goldman should eliminate some of those clean blockers coming up to the second level. You also need the rest of the defense to step up, but you still have some of those concerns that how much of this is, I don't want to say permanent, but like how much of this was just a 1-year blip for Trevathan and how much of this is signs that more decline is coming for him in the next season and seasons beyond. Especially, I think the concerns for me are more so with injuries at this point. And if the Bears have to turn to the backup linebackers for extended periods of time, it really doesn't seem to me like they trust the young depth that they have behind their linebackers based on some of their recent moves at the position. We'll go through this group in question and kind of figure out how the Bears have been ignoring the players they've been developing next on Locked On Bears. I know that I for sure trust that every time I open up a box of Built Bars, I'm going to get the world's best tasting protein bar because they really are delicious. They taste like candy bars, but they have the nutrients of a protein bar. Every single Built Bar is covered in 100% real chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, but most importantly, low sugar, low calories, but high fiber and high protein. You combine that with delicious taste, a variety of amazing flavors, you really can't go wrong. They've got a mixed box that sends you all the different flavors. I have tried every single one, and you can't go wrong with any of them. Personal favorites, salted caramel, coconut, raspberry, cookies and cream. Have a box of strawberry on its way to my house right now. Really looking forward to cracking into that and getting that sweet treat that I really find myself having to limit myself to just one a day because otherwise I'm just going to go through them too fast. I'm telling you, you got to try them for yourself. Head on over to BuiltBar.com and use our promo code LOCKED15 to save 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. If I'm Joel Iyiegbuniwe or Josh Woods, two of the Bears' young backup linebackers that have been developing in this system for a few years and earning their way onto the roster and all those great stories that we like to hear. If I'm them, I'm not exactly feeling the love lately from the Bears organization. And it's weird because I think Josh Woods just signed his exclusive rights free agent extension this offseason. Very cheap, but the Bears chose to bring him back. And yet I still feel like they've been kind of doing anything they can to avoid playing him and Iyiegbuniwe. If you think back to how these sort of players have come up in the system, Woods was the undrafted free agent back in 2018, real athletic, speedy linebacker. And again, one of these guys that just finds a way to stick around, doesn't let the team get rid of him in any way. And it's slowly like, it was kind of a surprise to me when I was looking through it. This is going to be his 4th year with the Bears. A lot of that has been on the practice squad the first couple of seasons, but he's been elevated and played a lot of special teams the last 2 years and really been pretty active for an undrafted free agent that had 2 very established starters ahead of him on the depth chart. Came in the same year they drafted Roquan Smith, and also the same year they drafted Joel Iyiegbuniwe in the 4th round. So he too, entering his 4th year in Chicago, I think that makes it the last year of his rookie deal. We've hardly seen him play. And of course, yes, they've had Trevathan and Roquan Smith. When they're healthy, those are the guys that are going to play. But we have seen a couple of seasons of Danny Trevathan injuries, and we saw Roquan Smith get injured. Was that 2019? Ended that season on injured reserve as well, if I remember correctly. And we still really haven't seen Woods or Iggy, as they call him, get on the field. I think in 3 seasons, Iyiegbuniwe has played 55 total snaps on defense. It's really just been a he'll play in the goal line package and some garbage time snaps here and there. But when they have an injury, they've always sort of gone to someone else. It's just been, those two guys have been great special teams players, and that's very valuable to have, and that's why they've been able to stick on this roster. But they've been developing for a while now, and they still can't get snaps on defense. They've been in this defense and practicing it every day with their teammates and for 3 years, going in year 4, and those opportunities just haven't been there. And I don't know that they're going to be there this year, even if Danny Trevathan or Roquan Smith gets hurt. Because the Bears signed Christian Jones this offseason, kind of an old friend, a guy who played in this Bears defense before, in the old days, in the Mel Tucker defensive days. Not a bright time in Bears defensive history or for Christian Jones, but he's a very experienced backup. He was a starter with the Detroit Lions, and obviously comes to Chicago on the bench. But for me, he's the guy that's going to step on the field if there's an injury. I mean, he's first one off the bench for sure. And it's like we saw it last year when Roquan Smith was hurt in the wild card game against the playoffs. It's kind of easy to forget that they did have a slight linebacker injury at the end there. And it wasn't Joel Iyiegbuniwe or Josh Woods that the Bears started in that wild card playoff game against the Saints. Do you remember who it was? I was blown away. I had sort of forgotten this. Had slipped my mind, and kind of a weird, stark reminder that the Bears started Manti Te'o at linebacker in the wild card playoff game. He didn't play at all in the 2020 season. He was a street free agent. The Bears added him into the practice squad late in the year. So he was with the team for a handful of weeks, maybe a month, a little bit over a month, practicing. Had not played a snap all season. Barely played in 2019. I think he had 2 games he played in 2019, coincidentally as a member of the New Orleans Saints, but he had played 2 games in 2 seasons, comes to Chicago off of the street, and they start him in a playoff game instead of the 4th-round pick that had been in the scheme for 3 years, or the undrafted free agent who had been in the scheme for 3 years. 2 guys that should know this defense very, very well. They say, no, sorry, we're going to start this guy who just got here a few weeks ago and is still learning the defense. We're going to get him in there instead of you. I mean, I get that Manti Te'o has starting experience in his past. He has been a more experienced NFL linebacker than Iyiegbuniwe or Josh Woods, but I mean, it's a playoff game and it's the end of the season, and he hasn't even been fresh on the field that year, let alone learning this Bears defense for 3 years the way Woods and Iggy had. So for me, it just seems like a really bad sign for those young Bears linebackers, and kind of a bad sign for the future of the Bears linebacker position. I mean, eventually Danny Trevathan is going to be done, and who's going to replace him? Who's the heir apparent here? Because it feels like right now, given that Iyiegbuniwe and Woods can't get on defense, that the future pair at linebacker with Roquan Smith is not maybe on the roster right now. I mean, it seems like something that soon here, you got to start figuring out your contingency plan for when you ultimately do move on from Danny Trevathan and you've got Roquan Smith in the prime of his career. You're going to want somebody there to pair with him. And it doesn't feel like that player is here yet. But we're going to keep a close eye on this linebacker rotation all throughout training camp. So make sure that you subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Don't forget to check out the Locked On Bears YouTube channel as well to keep up with all of the video podcasts coming your way. As we'll keep our training camp previews rolling this week, we'll turn our attention to the secondary. And then next week, they're back in action. They're coming to Hallis Hall, and we will be all over every second of it. So I hope you'll keep following along. I appreciate those of you that have stuck with us throughout this long offseason. It can be a bit of a desert with no Bears football, but I hope Locked On Bears has been a little bit of an oasis to make it easier for you to bear down.